Saint Therese of Lisieux is indisputably one of the most beloved saints in modern times. Her autobiography, The Story of the Soul, has been translated into over 55 languages. The out-of-the-way Lisieux Basilica receives more than 2 million pilgrims each year, and she has been named co-patroness of France with Saint Joan of Arc, co-patroness of missions with Saint Francis Xavier, and a doctor of the Church. But despite her widespread appeal, Saint Therese is often misunderstood. Many see her life through a romanticized lens, a saintly childhood, a dramatic trip to Rome, a swift entry into religious life, and an early death to be with her divine spouse. And this idealized view can lead readers of her autobiography to form misconceptions about her. Her frequent use of the word little in describing everything can make her seem childish. Her abundant love and gratitude can make her spiritual journey seem overly sentimental. And her description of the little way as an elevator to heaven can make her spirituality seem easy. But to stop with these surface-level impressions is to miss out on the profound lessons her life and spirituality offer. To truly understand Saint Therese, one must remove the romanticized lens and look directly at the intense sufferings revealed by her greatest trial, her final illness. Suffering from tuberculosis, Saint Therese often struggled to breathe, was frequently exhausted, and was wasting away. But even worse than her physical suffering was the spiritual. Therese had always leaned on her faith and hope in previous trials, but in her final trial of faith, she was tormented by atheistic temptations and a feeling that God had abandoned her. And for a self-proclaimed little soul to persist in faith despite such harrowing suffering, Saint Therese needed to use everything Jesus had revealed to her. She needed her little way. But before diving right into the story of this trial and the secrets it unearths, it's necessary to recognize what the little way is not. And Saint Therese reveals this to her sister Pauline. During her final illness, Pauline said she must have been through many struggles to reach such perfection. Saint Therese denied this claim, adding, "Holiness does not consist of this or that practice. It consists in a disposition of the heart, which makes us always humble and little in the arms of God. Well aware of our feebleness, but boldly confident in the Father's goodness." For Saint Therese, holiness is a disposition, not some specific practices. And the little way too is not a roadmap to holiness, but a disposition of the heart which attracts God's graces into one's life and makes one holy. And this disposition consists of 5 fundamental elements exemplified by Therese during this last trial. The first aspect of the little way is humility. And even at the start of her final illness, Saint Therese demonstrates the humility God gave her. In April of 1897, her last sickness began. By May, she was unable to participate in community exercises and was at times suspected by her fellow sisters of exaggerating her illness. In addition, she wrestled with a growing sense of separation from God. In the suffering, it would have been easy to become frustrated with her lowliness, yet Therese embraced her littleness, saying, "On being discharged from all my duties, I have been impressed by the thought that my death will not cause the least inconvenience in the community." Most people would be upset about being dispensable, but Therese didn't see it that way. She didn't worry about her insignificance because she knew anything good she did came from God. And being only his instrument, she readily acknowledged the other sisters could serve his purposes just as well. Therese had absorbed the truth of Jesus' teaching that apart from me, you can do nothing. She accepted that he was all and she was nothing. Further, in striving to cultivate humility, Saint Therese sought to hide her sufferings and virtues, so only God would witness them. And she succeeded in the same so completely that a fellow sister reportedly said, "I do not see why anyone speaks of Sister Therese of Child Jesus as a saint. She has practiced virtue, it is true, but not a virtue acquired through suffering and humiliation." The value of hiding sufferings and virtues for Therese was twofold. First, it allowed her to focus only on pleasing God and to mortify her vanity. And second, it permitted her to imitate Christ as the suffering servant described by Isaiah. "He had no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not." Humility is at the core of Saint Therese's entire spiritual approach and is unveiled by her illness. But humility alone might have left her discouraged, if not for her great confidence in God. In June of 1897, St. Therese's illness worsened, and she was unable to stand without the help of others. Her spiritual temptations promised her death would be followed by nothingness, and her ever-reliable hope was gone. Yet in her tremendous confidence, she longed for death and heaven thereafter. When the chaplain asked her if she was resigned to die, Therese responded, Father, I find I need rather to be resigned to live. I experience, on the other hand, only joy at the thought of death. Despite the atheistic temptations she suffered, her confidence in God was so strong that she longed for death. But what was the source of this confidence? Perhaps the greatest source was her recognition of the merciful, loving character of God as the perfect Father. Therese received the grace to be raised by a saintly father, Louis Martin, who along with his wife, Zélie, were the first married couple to be canonized together as saints. And it was this father who helped instill in St. Therese immense filial trust, a filial trust that naturally extended to God as the perfect Father. And St. Therese's conviction of God as the perfect Father even changed how she saw his justice. Writing to a missionary priest she advised, she said, "It is this justice which frightens so many souls, which is the subject of my joy and my trust. To be just is not only to exercise severity to punish the guilty, it is also to recognize right intentions and to reward virtue." God recognizes the weakness of human nature, or as St. Therese said, he remembers that we are only dust. And because he knows of man's weakness, to be perfectly just is to take this weakness into account when judging his children. And in this way, Therese sees how God's mercy is imbued even into his justice. And this knowledge of God is what allows St. Therese to have complete confidence in him. However, as her illness wore on, the next aspect of her little way would become increasingly important: patience. In July of 1897, St. Therese's illness continued its downward progression. She struggled to sleep, had fits of suffocation, and frequently coughed up blood. She was so weak that she could no longer write her autobiography with pen and switched to pencil. Spiritually, she felt heaven was closed to her and fought to believe. But rather than wishing for a quick end to this suffering, she was content to wait for God's timing. She says, "Just as I have been obliged to practice patience while awaiting all the other great events of my life, so is it now in my expectation of death. I entered Carmel young, and yet there was a 3 months delay. For receiving the habit, there was a similar delay. For my profession, another postponement. Very well, for my death it will be the same." And although she longed to receive extreme unction, she was content to wait for God's timing there as well. Pauline describes that when Father Superior came to decide about administering extreme unction, St. Therese was so cheerful and agreeable, in spite of her suffering, that they decided not to give her the sacrament she so yearned to receive. Although she failed to receive the last sacrament on the 9th, on July 30th, God willed to give it to her. That day, she was coughing up blood all day and had to be given ether to help her breathe. As she finally received the sacrament, all the details were being prepared in the next room for her burial. But on the next day, she was back to her normal level of sickness. Each time she felt as though the divine thief was finally in sight. He disappeared. St. Therese's patience allowed her to suffer without a clear end in sight and to wait for God's timing. But the next aspect of her little way allowed her to love her suffering, abandonment to God's will. By August of 1897, St. Therese's illness was worse than ever. When examined after the Feast of the Assumption, the doctor said, "The right lung is completely gone. She is very emaciated, and the tuberculosis has reached its final stage." Spiritually, she fared no better, and in a single night, constantly made acts of faith in opposition to the incessant temptations assaulting her. And yet, she didn't seek to get away from this suffering for 1 second. When Pauline lamented that her prayers for Therese to suffer less had not been answered, Therese responded, "I have asked God not to hear the prayers that would place an obstacle to the accomplishment of his designs upon me." In her abandonment to God's will, Therese sought not to escape the sufferings that assaulted her constantly. Instead, she longed for whatever God sent, saying about her terrible suffering, "I love it. I love whatsoever God gives me." Her love of suffering sprung from her love of God and her knowledge of his goodness. She knew whatever he willed for her was part of his plan of goodness. Thus, each suffering was a grace that allowed her to participate in his plan. For this reason, she didn't want to miss out on even the smallest of these opportunities, whether it was a shoulder pain or eating food she found loathsome. Influenced heavily by St. John of the Cross, she quotes him as saying, The smallest act of love is more to the church than every other work put together. And Saint Therese wanted to demonstrate her profound love of God with every act she performed. This love, which is the final aspect of her little way, is the foundation of all the other aspects. And it was this love that carried her through the prolonged suffering of her final trial and brought her to the last days of her worldly pilgrimage. By the end of September, Saint Therese's suffering was near its peak. She was so thin that she called herself a skeleton, so weak that she couldn't make the sign of the cross, and so sick that she increasingly struggled to breathe. Spiritually, she received no respite from her difficulties, and at one point admitted she was receiving no consolation, but only pure agony. And yet, this suffering was what she wanted. In her act of oblation to merciful love, Saint Therese prayed, "It is with joy I shall contemplate you on the last day, carrying the scepter of your cross. Since you deigned to give me a share of this very precious cross, I hope in heaven to resemble you. I want to work for your love alone, with the one purpose of pleasing you, consoling your Sacred Heart, and saving souls who will love you eternally." Because of her love, Saint Therese's greatest desires were to resemble Jesus, to please him, and to make him more loved. And it is in her suffering that she is able to achieve all three of these desires. Through her suffering, she can resemble him in his passion, she can please him by suffering joyfully out of love, and she can make him more loved by offering her suffering for the sake of souls. With suffering being the key that unlocks her greatest desires, how could it be anything but sweet to her? She affirms this sentiment on the day of her death, saying, "Everything I have written about my desires for suffering, oh, it is true just the same. I'm not sorry for having surrendered myself to love. On the contrary." That day, at around 5 in the evening, Saint Therese's agony began. The sisters gathered as she held her crucifix, her eyes fixed on it. Her breathing grew labored, her body trembled, and sweat poured from her forehead. When the Angelus rang at 6, Therese raised her eyes pleadingly to the statue of the Virgin Mary. Shortly after 7, the prioress, thinking the end was not near, dismissed the community. Therese sighed and said, "Oh, Mother, is it not yet the agony? Am I not going to die?" "Yes, my child, it is the agony, but perhaps the good God wills to prolong it for some hours." "Ah, well, so be it, so be it. Oh, I do not wish to suffer less." Then looking at her crucifix, she said, "Oh, I love him. My God, I love thee." These were Saint Therese's last words, and as the prioress rushed to call the community back to her bedside, Therese's gaze turned to the heavens and expressed a happiness that surpassed all her desires. No one can say what she saw in those last moments. But given the explosive popularity of her autobiography after her death, maybe God confirmed that her mission to teach her way to little souls was indeed about to begin. But if her little way is to spread as it ought, Catholics must look past the misunderstandings surrounding her to the truth revealed in her final illness. Far from being childish, at 24 she was theologically mature, anything but sentimental. She abandoned herself through great sufferings, and in no way choosing an easy path. Her way demanded her whole self. And the Church has affirmed Saint Therese's little way at every turn. Each successive pope has extolled her teaching, and Pope St. John Paul II even called her way nothing other than the gospel way of holiness for all. Hers is a path suitable for every Catholic. A path of humility, confidence, patience, abandonment, and love. A path to Jesus.